Well, it certainly feels like the country is winding down. And as we use this time to reflect on the impact of COVID-19 on South Africa this year, the aftershocks are still reverberating through the manufacturing sector. The sector was on its knees before COVID struck due to a range of factors, from load shedding to steel input costs, disagreements on how to pursue localization, issues around competitiveness, and also dealing with leaky customs. Now, one just has to drive through the former industrial belts of the East Rand and Vereeniging to see where we've gone from conveyor belts to rust belt. But the manufacturing sector is high on the government's agenda for the economic rebuild, and the contribution that it could make towards creating sustainable jobs is at least appreciated. Whether we can all agree on how to achieve that remains to be seen. The latest PMI shows that manufacturing production slowed down in November as the reintroduction of COVID-19 lockdowns in Europe affected South Africa's export activity. AMSA's Purchasing Managers Index, the PMI, declined to 52.6 from a record 60.9 in October. To discuss the year that was and the way forward for the local manufacturing sector, I'm joined now by Philippa, Executive Director of the Manufacturing Circle, Gerhard Papenfus, Chief Executive of the National Employers Association of South Africa, NIASA, and Nicolette, MD of fabricator Betterect. Philippa, set the scene for us here. Manufacturing was one of the worst affected sectors by COVID-19 just due to the nature of the impact, which forced many factories to shutter, exports to grind to a halt, and workers sent home during the lockdown. Just take us back to the impact of the hard lockdown on your members.
Absolutely, that's well said, Michael, in terms of the challenges we've experienced over the course of the year. And generally, it talks to the fact that the manufacturing sector is an ecosystem. So if we are looking how to deal with lockdown levels from 5 all the way down to 1 in response to what it is we need to do to keep our workers safe, in addition to lower demand, in addition to having learned a lesson as to our reliance on global value chains and single source inputs. All of those have put various stresses on the manufacturing sector. In addition, it's talked always to the importance of us needing to be agile. So what it is that we have had to do to get back to workplace readiness in terms of having safety measures within our factories, where it is that we could pivot to the extent that we've been able to in terms of ramping up local manufacture of medical equipment, personal protective equipment, and what closed borders have really done to us and reduced demand. So it's been an incredibly tough year, as it has been for the entire economy.
And within that, obviously, pockets of opportunity as well. If you just look at the latest PMI, it shows that the sector is struggling. What are your members telling you at the moment?
Well, at the moment, Michael, I mean, we're busy ramping up for the, a potential second wave, where our members are managing to function. They're doing the best of their ability to do so, but it's very, very tough. It's very tight. Margins are thin. We've had to have a look at working capital cycles, and in addition, general blockages that are always there that we need to address are a little more in the spotlight. Whether it's lack of municipal service delivery, I mean, that impacts on our ability to run factories, to dealing with port operations, to deal with exports and imports that are there. It's difficult time. So, we have been able to find certain pockets of opportunity, as you indicate, in the medical equipment or PPE space. Where do those opportunities sit? But it's a difficult time that lies ahead. And if you've got subdued demand, and that has to do with what we see in terms of GDP growth or lack thereof, the rest is expected to impact.
Gerhard, what stands out for you as we look in the rearview mirror of this brutal year? Obviously, as a National Employers Association, you are intimately involved with TERS, and we saw how that didn't withstand the blowtorch of pressure when that arrived. There's obviously the issue of Eskom that was there before COVID. There's now this whole issue of localization and import substitution. We've got steel tariffs is obviously a big issue. What stands out for you, and what was a very interesting year for manufacturing?
Let's talk about TERS. I think there's much to be said in terms of them not fully comply to what the expectation was, but on the other side, I think one must be reasonable. They got something together in a space of a few weeks, and I think for them that's quite a miracle. So we're still doing surveys, and as far as April and May is concerned, their paying out was quite a high level, but I think those employers, and that April, for instance, 10% of employers haven't been paid. May, 15% haven't been paid, and I suspect they're not going to be paid. That is, if you made a mistake once on your application, then your application will be rejected, and I think employers will struggle for years to come to get that money, and that has put a couple of companies in severe distress. I think manufacturing was severely hard hit, and I've just said it to you prior to we were on air, that our 50 lawyers have spent 50% of their time just retrenching. Now, there's some relief in that area, and I think it's less so. So I think there's improvement, but then the second wave hit us, and that is in terms of steel shortages and steel prices. So employers came out of the COVID horror, and now they want to manufacture, and now they don't have steel, and the steel prices is so outrageous that they can't. It's got a huge impact on sales. So that is a bit of a horror story at the moment, and it is something that's going to be with us unless government changes its policy. Now, unless government lifts the duties, this type of thing is going to continue into next year, and so I think in terms of the future, government will have to take their hands off. Will have to have a lighter touch to allow business to be business, and to find ways. Philippa talked, we need to be agile. We cannot be agile if you're subjected to all kinds of regulations and laws who's binding your hands. So, but that's a far stretch. I don't think that government is about to have this lighter touch. Their ideology is simply one of intervention, and that is hammering industry.
From industry's perspective, Nicolette, and you're a fabricator, you operate in the mining space. Firstly, the impact of COVID-19 on your business must have been far less because mining operations were allowed to remain open. But I just want to get your sense of how you've managed to operate through that environment. And to the second point that Gerhard raised about steel pricing, I have it on good authority that AMSA has applied for a 120% safeguard to be applied on long products. I just want to get your thoughts on that and whether or not that's correct.
Thanks, Michael. So let's, I suppose, start with the impact of COVID on our business as well as other businesses in our space. It was definitely a difficult year, even though mining, a lot of mines did remain operational, a lot of mines didn't. We were closed during level 5, and during level 4 we were only allowed to operate at 50%. That limitation was only opened up at level 3, so it definitely raised a lot of difficulties. And even though we were allowed to claim force majeure in terms of extensions of times with our clients, it was still an extremely difficult process with absenteeism and even price hikes for things such as consumables, because obviously the exchange rate fluctuated so significantly. So it really has been an extremely difficult year. And then to top it off, obviously the challenges that we are facing at the moment with steel prices and steel shortages. So the 120% safeguard that you are referring to is correct. They have indeed applied for a 120% safeguard, and maybe just to explain a little bit in terms of the long products, that's the beams, angle irons, channels. There is obviously the safeguard that was imposed on the hot rolled product, which was plate, and technically that is currently being challenged legally as to the legality of the extension, because that safeguard was extended. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that has been dropped, hopefully, but it's a bit of a difficulty. So what's happening at the moment, which is making the steel shortages worse, is that some of the merchants are reluctant to import steel to mitigate the effects of the shortages, because the mills aren't rolling, but they don't want to because they fear that this 120% safeguard is going to be imposed. And if that is the case, then obviously they won't be able to sell the steel in the market.
And in terms of sourcing steel, I mean, how difficult is that, as we see AMSA is ramping up its production at in Vanderbijl Park, and the promise was by the CEO the last time we had him on a panel that he'd be able to supply into the market. Are you finding that the reality?
That's definitely not the case, and many of the players that I've spoken to in the market, they've had commitments from AMSA in terms of deliveries that they were guaranteed, in a sense, to receive, and they received 20% of the November commitment. And that makes it extremely difficult to operate and achieve your deadlines with your clients.
Just stay right there, Nicolette. We're going to take a quick break. When we return, we'll continue talking about the impact of COVID-19 on South Africa's manufacturing sector, and we'll come back to this issue of steel pricing, which is just a second whammy to go along with worries about second waves for a sector that was already on its knees prior to COVID. Welcome back to the show. We're asking manufacturing Quo Vadis, where to from here? If it's not Eskom, if it's not COVID, it's government intervention. It's happening in the steel subsector of manufacturing at the moment. And Nicolette Skjoldhammer, you were sharing with us before the break that, in fact, AMSA has applied for a 120% tariff safeguard on the long products, which are the beams, etc. What impact would that have? I believe that even a 5 or 10% impact would have a very severe impact on the downstream sector. What impact would a 120% increase have?
It would be completely and utterly catastrophic. To put it into perspective, if you're looking at a mild steel fabrication, approximately you have a 50% material cost and a 50% labor price. The feedback that we get from our international clients on an ongoing basis is that we out by about 5 to 10%, which is actually very achievable in terms of if we can get a drop in the input steel pricing. There is opportunity for the South African economy to bring that work to South Africa. But now let's talk about 120% safeguard being imposed. That effectively translates into a 60% price increase, 60. So now we're losing prices or jobs for a price difference of 2 to 5%. How could we compete at all for 60%? I can categorically say that businesses like mine would probably be closed in 6 to 12 months if this safeguard is passed.
On that issue, how much work are you seeing placed under threat by the issue of a competitive input steel price and a lack of reliability of supply?
For all of it. As a fabricator, when we're pricing our international clients and tendering on projects, we need to have a reliable supply chain in order to make commitments of delivery dates. Our ultimate client doesn't care whether the goods are fabricated in South Africa or Turkey or India or Mexico. They are international global clients. They are interested in security of delivery dates being met at a competitive price. And to have this massive chaos going on in our market area of South Africa does no service to our industry, because the international clients are, they want to know when they're getting their goods at a reasonable price.
Philippa, from the manufacturing circle's perspective, what are your members saying about this issue of, firstly, the reliability of supply by AMSA of steel, and B, of this extraordinarily high safeguard protection that's being sought?
It makes it very difficult to plan, in essence. I think we've had an indication from a company level as to the impacts as far as pricing is concerned, and ability to tender on projects, and that is absolutely critical. In order for us to grow the sector or sustain the sector, and despite the issues of COVID and the difficult year we've had, we cannot afford to become a wasteland of imports. We need to be competitive in our sector, and if we're dealing with global bids, it's very important to be able to be competitive from a pricing point of view. So absolutely, these issues talk to the entire value chain, the pressure that upstream producers are pushing onto the rest of industry. And on the flip side, we as the manufacturing circle are always looking to identify ways to grow demand for our manufactured product. We need a pull factor. So to the extent that there might be new projects in Mozambique, in relation to gas, etc., gas projects and infrastructure, one needs to have competitively priced inputs in order to be able to be competitive, because we are dealing in a global environment. So it is challenging.
But it does speak, Gerhard, to bring you back into this broader ideological perspective through which government approaches the manufacturing sector. We saw it very much in the local content requirements, which are expected to be published by the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition. And it goes to this idea that government can dictate to the manufacturing sector exactly what its input costs should be, and expect to know and understand the dynamics of a highly dynamic market like this that needs agility. Back to Philippa's earlier point, what do you see unfolding in the steel space at the moment?
Well, what I've noted is that a few months ago, perhaps a year ago, in discussions with the DTI, where all the major role players in the steel industry were involved, there weren't consensus on the role of AMSA. There were not consensus on the role of AMSA. There was some sympathy for import duties. I was on ITAC soon after the Steel Committee was established, and I actually left that committee because I was a lone voice in that committee. And when you're in a committee, you can't criticize. So I left to criticize from the outside. What has happened in the meantime? I think there's consensus amongst all role players that the duties has got to go. So everybody below AMSA says duties has got to go. We need to import, if that is the case, if that's what we need to do, we need to import best quality steel at the best price. There's no alternative. AMSA cannot produce. AMSA is an old facility. They cannot compete with what the world has to offer, and you cannot deny South African manufacturers the best steel at the best price.
Now, do our ports have the capacity, just on that point, if we were to say, let's import up to 100% of our requirements and let the market do with AMSA what markets do with uncompetitive producers, do we have the capacity to import 100% of our requirements?
Well, I'm going to answer part of it. Nicolette has written quite a good piece, which was submitted to ITAC, and I think she must elaborate on that.
Sure.
But a couple of years ago, South Africa imported 4.5 million tons of maize, and we could do that. The point is, we have to, if there is a shortcoming, we have to jack that up. Because there is no alternative. We cannot compete with the world, but there's, and we don't know. And I think Ibrahim Patel needs to be frank with us. Why are they protecting AMSA? Is it a question of prestige? Do they just want to say, like SAA, we've got a primary steel producer? Well, we say we don't need a primary steel producer unless that primary steel producer is able to compete with the best in the world? Is there ideological reason? You know, in 2015, previous Minister Rob Davis dropped the 5% duties which existed at the time. Then there was a visit by Lakshmi Mittal to President Zuma, and immediately thereafter, a BEE deal was introduced. 10% custom duties was introduced, and shortly after that, a further 12% safeguard duties. Now, to what extent is that playing a role, and is the downstream paying for this disastrous decision? And government doesn't come out and tell us exactly, and they're avoiding debate. I mean, they allow a certain element of the debate to take place, but they don't go to where we can ask questions from them as to exactly why are you doing this? What is the influence Lakshmi Mittal is having in South Africa? Why is this old facility protected? So whatever we say, unless government come to the fore and be honest and is prepared to make a brave decision in this regard, we're going to struggle in the years to come as well.
Absolutely, and in, you know, without transparency, it's very difficult not to speculate as to the reasons why and joining political dots here. But I don't want to go too much into the world of speculation. Nicolette, from your perspective, do we have the capacity through our ports to start bringing all of this steel in?
So it was a question that I was asked during the public hearing with regards to the 120% safeguard from ITAC. It is something that I'm currently still investigating. It's not necessarily something that I'm 100% familiar with, obviously being a fabricator in terms of the capacity of the ports, but I'll try my best. But the initial feedback that I have got from my investigations is that yes, the ports do have capacity. I think it's also important to remember that a couple of years ago, AMSA were exporting 3 million tons of steel a year. That is no longer, you know, or we exporting, let me rephrase, so they're exporting 3 million tons less than they were a couple of years ago. So if we look at the current usage of structural members of steel in South Africa, we're currently sitting at about 2.5 million tons. So that figure falls well below, in my opinion, the capacity that the port was already servicing a couple of years ago, which is now no longer. I think something important to state as well is that Cyril Ramaphosa, our president, has already indicated that there is a huge drive to go from road to rail. And I think given that steel, when it is imported, is not containerized, it is imported predominantly as a bulk commodity, that fits very well into the drive in terms of supporting Transnet, bringing income to Transnet to try and grow that industry. And I suppose just my last thought on the subject would be, what is the alternative? So let's say we don't support the downstream. The downstream will die. That is categorically going to happen. So we support the upstream, but the upstream cannot exist without our downstream. So ultimately the upstream will die as well. So surely, even if port capacity is a concern, surely choosing growth over devastation is the only solution. And with that, we take the adversity to try and create the opportunity to have an influx of revenue into our ports and take that revenue and let it grow the ports over the next 10 to 15 years.
Well, one does hope that the common sense will prevail, but I found in this country it's the hope that kills you more often than not. Philippa, as we've got a minute and a half to go, what is your outlook for the manufacturing sector into 2021? It is comforting that at least Eskom hasn't run any diesel generators for the last 40 days. What is your outlook for next year?
Well, Michael, in summary, as always, it's going to be challenging for the sector. But in having said that, we need to identify where the opportunities are. And we do have pockets of excellence. So where is it that we can grow demand for locally manufactured product? To the extent that it's competitive and economically viable, where can we replace imports? How can we increase exports? And how can we focus on the biggest supply side challenges, and energy being one of those? So absolutely, let's watch that space. In addition to ideas on how we can deal with lack of municipal service delivery, and just hope that we manage to continue this engine of growth for our economy. We've got to sustain it.
There's that hope again. There's a very interesting paper by DNA Economics about the issue of local content requirements that can easily lead to economic distortions and raise prices over the long term. So I'm certainly not as sanguine on that particular point. Philippa, Executive Director of the Manufacturing Circle, Gerhard Papenfus, Chief Executive of the National Employers Association of South Africa, NIASA, and Nicolette, MD of Betterect, looking in the rearview mirror and also talking about the steel debacle that is currently unfolding. Common sense better prevail soon.